started working for myself, and I found that I was actually the worst boss that I'd ever had. It wasn't some culture of a company or manager that was like pushing me to work all the time, or to open my laptop on the weekends, or to feel like shit when I didn't meet my internally imposed goals. It was just my own sort of nature of my self-worth being tethered to my productivity.
All right, let's kick off today's show. Today we're talking with Simone Stolzoff, an expert on work-life balance and the future of work. We discuss why chasing your dream job might actually be a trap. Simone is a writer and designer from San Francisco whose work has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and The Atlantic, amongst many other publications. He's the author of the book, The Good Enough Job, Reclaiming Life from Work. Today we discover how good enough jobs actually free you to live better, the secret to creating work boundaries for more fulfilling relationships outside of work, and understanding why time autonomy might be your red Corvette. Welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Welcome to the show. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Now, your book is titled The Good Enough Job. What does good enough mean?
On first read, you might think it's like a slacker manifesto, right? Just like do a good enough job, settle, like don't look for something that you love. But I think the way that I think about it is a good enough job is a job that lets you be the person that you want to be. I like it because it's sufficiently subjective, right? For one person, it could be a job in a certain industry. For someone else, it's maybe a job with a certain title. For someone else, maybe it's a job that lets off at a certain hour so they can go pick up their kid from daycare or elementary school each day. But in general, I think my philosophy is that a good enough job is a job that lets you support the life that you want to live. I think too often we sort of treat the job as the central axis of our lives, and everything else gets pushed into the margins. And the argument in the book is our job should be able to support the life that we want to live as opposed to the other way around.
And I think it's really important to focus on you. So many of us think about dream job for others, impress our friends or peers, make our family happy, and all the external pressure that we have around what our career brings us. But this is really at a core, what's important to you to define good enough.
The sort of first notion of this idea came when I was a senior in college. I was a poetry student. Actually, that's not completely true. I was a poetry and economics student. So you can already see sort of an existential crisis looming on the horizon. And I had the chance to interview my favorite writer in the entire world. He's this poet named Anis Mojgani. And I asked him, Anis, how do you feel about the mantra, do what you love and never work a day in your life? And I was expecting him to give me this like pep talk, like go follow your passion, kid, and the money will follow. And he didn't. He said, Simone, I think some people do what they love for work and others do what they have to so they can do what they love when they're not working. And neither is more noble. And I think, that gets right at the point that you were making. Maybe some people want to live a work-centric existence, and for others, their job is more of a means to an end. But I think Anis's point, and sort of the point of the book more broadly, is that when we are expecting our jobs to always be a dream, to always be perfect, and create these massive expectations and a lot of room for disappointment underneath them.
Well, we have definitely talked about on the show the rise of secularism and the lack of religiosity. And I would almost argue that workism has now replaced religion for a lot of us. And our career is now central to our lives in ways that, earlier in this past century was just not common.
Yeah, totally. Like if you look at the peak of religiosity in the US, it was in the 50s, and about 3 or 4% of Americans didn't associate with a religion. And now the number is almost 1 in 3. And, there's many explanations for how we got here. But I think the upshot is that the institutions that once gave us community and purpose and identity have withered. And in their place, people have looked to the place where they spend the majority of their time, which is the workplace. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Work can definitely be a source of community, a source of identity, a source of purpose. But the argument that I make is that it can be dangerous when it's the sole source of identity or purpose of meaning in your life. For one, your job might not always be there. I think lots of people found this out during the pandemic. If you're putting all of your identity eggs in the work basket and you get laid off or you get furloughed or you are a traveling rock star that can no longer go on tour, it can leave you asking, what's left? Who are you if you are what you do? There's also the notion that we are all more than just what we do for work. Certainly we are all more than just workers. We are artists and travelers and neighbors and parents and friends. And if we underinvest in these other aspects of who we are, it's sort of like, they're like plants. They need energy and attention in order to grow. And if we don't invest in them, they can wither.
For many in our audience, this always on culture is now also steeped with, work is family. And we try to extend the value of work beyond just what the purpose of the work is, but the community associated with it. And there's been a huge push now to move from hybrid back to the workplace and to try to foster this culture. But it is dangerous, as you say, if we center our entire identity and those relationships, community around our work.
For one, I think the metaphor of like work as family isn't necessarily what we should be aspiring to. Like, I don't know many families that are very functional or that can get a lot done. But, I think it just starts to break down under a closer microscope. You can't get fired from your family if you fall on hard economic times. And I think in many ways, the general public has sort of come to understand this in the last 5 or 10 years or so. I think, especially in the early 2000s, there was this sort of ethos really driven by tech and Silicon Valley, and this idea that like your workplace can be your family and will take care of you, and you come here and you can make all of your friends, and we can be your go-to bar and your go-to dinner spot, and you can do laundry on campus. And I think those perks have been shown to be more of a trap than they are actually things that benefit workers. Obviously companies, they're not sort of twiddling their thumbs and saying, how can we squeeze the most out of their workers? But I think people have come to understand that if you are, spending dinner at the office, that's one less dinner than you're spending with the people that you love outside of work. And even some of these companies like the Googles and the Facebooks of the world that were heralded for having these all-inclusive sort of resort-type offices have been shown to not actually be serving their workers' best interest. And so I think, maybe a better metaphor is like a sports team. Think we're working together to try and achieve a goal, but at the end of the day, we're going to go home.
I think a lot of those big tech idealisms had been shattered during COVID. And I think a lot of that has to do with before COVID, people were still working. There was a lot of great idealisms and all the new tech that was coming out. But then when everyone was just working from home and everyone was on 24/7, that's when we started to see a lot of people's other interests, hobbies, philosophies getting interjected into their work. And for a lot of people, it's like, I'm just trying to order a pizza. I'm not trying to support this or that or any of these other things. And when we're being on all the time and we're making work our philosophical stands and our religion, it certainly tends to dilute a lot of the purpose and meaning of the company you're working for.
There's a line in the book that our desks were never made to be our altars. And, I think this is like a burden that our jobs are just not designed to bear. I think, Johnny, you point to like the two-sided nature of it. For one, people who were able to spend more time at home got to realize like, wow, it is amazing to be able to have a home-cooked meal, or to be able to eat lunch with my wife, or to be able to go on a walk at 4:30 as opposed to commuting 45 minutes both ways. But I think they also realized that, it's dangerous to have all of your community and identity centered around the workplace. I definitely know, like I'm thinking about my father-in-law, for example. He has worked for the same company for 40 years. And then in COVID, he worked from home for the first time. And he realized that like he hadn't invested in those non-work relationships. And he was at home and he no longer had the water cooler, and he no longer had, hobbies that gave him a sense of purpose. And he was just, another box on a Zoom screen. And I think it can be, very rude awakening if you haven't taken the time to diversify your identity. I think much like a investor benefits from diversifying the sources of stocks in their portfolio, I think we too benefit from investing in these other pillars of who we are, so that if one pillar were to crumble, we can stay standing.
I think it's really difficult when it's a top-down approach to work as family and culture. And obviously, a lot of these benefits that we talk about increase productivity. They keep you at the desk. They keep you tied to work. They blur the lines of when you're on and off work. and even unlimited vacation. They've seen, people take less vacation when they're given unlimited vacation because of the expectations that top-down approach to culture creates, where how am I supposed to get ahead if the person next to me is treating it like family, going to every dinner, going to every open bar event, and spending all of their time there when I have a newborn at home and I actually have a family outside of work that I want to spend time with. So how can we start to build those boundaries and still get ahead when there's this clash of what the company wants from us and then this pull of what we find meaning and purpose outside of work?
Before I dig into an answer, I think it's important to be clear that we don't have to over-index on the other side of the spectrum either. I think the perspective that like work sucks or that I'm anti-work or work is just a means to another end is not necessarily a recipe for fulfillment either. There's a risk of being too far on one end of the spectrum where you are maybe a company man that can't see past your own job title, or you consider yourself like a Googler first and foremost in your life. But I think there's a risk on the other side of the spectrum too, where if you don't feel like work matters at all, that's also a recipe for discontent if you're just treating it like a necessary evil. And so in terms of finding that nuance and finding that balance, I think both the most sort of enlightened individuals and the most progressive companies have taken an approach that really centers sustainable productivity. I think we all know on an individual level that if you're on hour 11 of a 12-hour day, or if you worked for 6 months in a row without taking any time off, you're not going to be firing at all cylinders. And so rather than burning the candle at both ends, trying to find a way that when you're on the clock, you're working, you're focused on work, but also you have those boundaries that you've erected in order to be able to not allow work to expand like a gas and fill all of your unoccupied space. And so one thing that I think about is that, caring less about your job is not very actionable advice. It's not something that you can just like turn a switch on and like, oh, all of a sudden I care less about my job. What I try and urge people to do is to care more about other things, to be able to invest in those other parts of who they are, those reminders that we exist on this earth to do more than just produce economic value, whether that's your relationships or your hobbies or setting aside, 15 minutes to learn a new language or to, play an instrument or to connect in the world in another way that doesn't center the economic value that you're producing.
Now, with drawing those boundaries, though, it's very difficult when your coworkers don't have those boundaries and you feel like the odd one out in a culture that's steeped in productivity. What can we start to do from our seat if we aren't in leadership to begin to build more of those boundaries, to find that time and space to learn a language or take on that artistic pursuit?
One thing that I think about is like, there is like the policy and then there's also the will, so as by means of an example, in Japan, they have one of the most progressive paternity leave policies in the world. New fathers are entitled to up to a year of paid time off. And yet the latest data shows that 5% of fathers took the time that they were allotted. And so it shows this kind of two-pronged approach that you need to take. On one hand, there's sort of like the top down. And in terms of top down, I'm thinking about things that companies or institutions or even, the government writ large can handle. I like to think about the difference between a boundary and a guardrail. You think about a boundary as sort of like the line in the middle of the road that sort of suggests that you stay in your lane, whereas the guardrail is like the metal on the side of the road that like prevents you from going off the rails. I think it's incumbent on the institutions in our life to erect those guardrails. So, for example, one of the reasons why our relationship to work is so fraught in the United States is because the consequences of losing work are so dire when your healthcare is tied to your job. If you're an immigrant, your ability to stay in this country is tied to your job. So from the top down, we need, companies and institutions erecting things like, paid time off and norms around people when they're expected to be online or responding to emails, and bosses and managers that set expectations for their team about when you're supposed to be on the clock and off the clock. But then as individuals, we also need the will to be able to erect these boundaries ourselves. And so one thing that I like to think about is intentions are pale in comparison when you're thinking about boundaries. We all have intentions to, set better boundaries or practice work-life balance. But what you actually need is infrastructure. You need to be able to turn your phone on airplane mode when you're playing with your kids. And so work is not an option. One of the benefits of, say, going for a run is that it's an activity that doesn't allow you to multitask while you're doing it. And we're all carrying around these offices in our pockets. It takes some discipline. It takes some will in order to be able to say, no, actually, I'm not going to swipe down to check my email during dinner. And so those are things that we need to cultivate on an individual level as well.
I think it's also important in those situations to then point out in your communication that, the things that you are responsible for are getting done, even if they might not be on the exact timetable, the expectations that your always on boss has. And we've had a number of clients that we've worked with who, their initial response is, I have to reply to this email. I have to reply to the Slack. And by simply setting a timer that the reply actually goes at 9 a.m. in the morning, you've started to create a little bit of space. And now that space becomes a new expectation of, okay, well, you're still responsive. You're still getting your tasks done. You're still helping the team move things forward, but you're doing it in a time frame that creates the space for you to play with your kids or go on that run or enjoy the Duolingo lesson that you've been putting off. And so many of these technological advancements also cut both ways. So we can actually use them to our advantage to start to build tinier boundaries. And as long as we're performing and we're showcasing that when we are showing up, we're always on and we're actually killing it at our job, then a lot of those expectations from others start to wither away a little bit. They're not as firm in the culture. And we've heard this time and time again that deliverables matter, and then your ability to communicate the deliverables matter. And you'll see a ripple effect within your office that, okay, now other people aren't slacking at 7:30 at night with an expectation that you reply. They're waiting until the morning, and then everyone has their timer set to send the Slack or the email in the morning when they actually are at their desk again.
Yeah, I think your episode a few weeks ago with the digital communications expert has some great tips on like how to actually create those norms for your team. And I think that it's also incumbent on bosses to be able to model the type of culture that they hope to create. I remember for the book, I interviewed the editor-in-chief of Wired, and she was saying that, at the time she was a manager and she thought she was doing her team a service of being sort of always on. You send her an email at 9:30 p.m. and she'd respond right away. Or on Slack, she'd always have that little green dot to show that she was available. But she actually talked to her team and she found that, when you were sending me an email at 9:30 p.m., it made me feel like I had to respond as well. And so what she thought she was doing to support her team was actually burning them out. And I think a lot of our expectations around the workplace are still holdovers from a more industrial age where there was a more direct relationship between, say, how many hours you spent on the assembly line and how many widgets you produced. But now, when a knowledge economy, there isn't necessarily a direct relationship between hours spent working and the quality of what you're producing. If your deliverable is, say, the headline for a marketing campaign or the strategy document for an organization for 10 years or something like a big idea for a podcast or for a book, there isn't always a direct relationship between the time you spend working on it and the quality of the work that you produce. In fact, your brain needs the space to be able to seek out inspiration from sources outside of your narrow purview, to be able to synthesize all of the inputs that you're taking in. I think one of the benefits of COVID is it showed that, if you can communicate the quality of the work that you're doing, if you can show what you're doing, the work doesn't necessarily speak for itself. You have to speak on behalf of the work that you're doing. But we can stop using these false proxies like the number of hours you spend in the office chair as a way to stand in for the actual quality of the work that you're producing. And hopefully, if you're able to articulate the work that you're doing to your boss, to your manager, to the forces that be, the work can speak for itself.
I think one of the downsides of being a high performer is the expectations you put on yourself can lead to that performance, but then they can also bleed into ideas like the dream job and thinking that everything that you're doing has to be incrementally leading you up a ladder. We have these expectations around our career, and I'd love for you to just unpack where the dream job concept came from and how it's been so negatively impacting those of us who are just trying to perform at such a high level.
And like with any term in the zeitgeist, there isn't like a very particular moment of like the first person to say dream job. But if you look at sort of the, say, mentions of the word dream job or meaningful work in the past 50 years, they were almost non-existent until about the 1970s. And it was around this time where the stagnant wages began that employers started to think, okay, how can we find these non-material ways to compensate our employees? And they said, okay, we can sort of frame work as a source of meaning, as a source of purpose. We live in a very individualistic society in the US. And I remember this speech from Steve Jobs. I think it was commencement speech in 2005. And he basically was like, the only way to do good work is to do what you love. And if you haven't found what you love, keep searching, never settle. And I think, I definitely bought into that narrative. I graduated college around that time, and I spent my entire 20s playing Goldilocks, trying to find that perfect job. And if I was ever bored or if I was ever feeling a little listless, I thought there was something wrong with the job. And so I hopped industries. I worked in advertising, and I worked in tech, and I worked in journalism, and I worked in design, all the while trying to find that vocational soulmate. And it wasn't until I realized that, every job has aspects of monotony. Every job has tedium that you have to go through. And in order to find a job that works for you, perfect is a very hard ideal to live up to. No job is always a dream. Rather than finding a job that is a dream job or the ultimate source of your passion, I think it's much more important to get good at a job, to develop skills that are rare and that are valuable. There's this great book that I love called So Good They Can't Ignore You, by Cal Newport. And his argument is basically like the actual way to improve in your career is to develop career capital, is to develop skills that are rare that people can pay you for. It's not necessarily finding that passion on some personality test and then pursuing that job wholeheartedly. Actually, passion is often the result of hard work rather than a precursor to hard work. And so it's through, recording thousands of episodes of a podcast or working as a journalist for a decade or really cultivating your craft that the passion and the love emerges. And I think often we have the causal relationship the other way around.
I think it's also hard to unpack the temporal nature of dream. So when I think of my dream job in my 20s, it was traveling around and running coaching programs and getting to see more of the world. Now that I have a family and a newborn, I don't want to be on the road. I actually want to be more work from home. I want to have more flexibility in my schedule and more virtual. And I think it's hard for us to wrap our heads around this might be a dream job now, but it might not be a dream job 20, 30 years from now when we climb the ladder and now we have new responsibilities and maybe we're not tapping into our skills that we're so passionate about, but we actually have to manage the passions and skills of team members and people below us. And I think that concept can be very difficult when you're starting out in your career. And I mean, if we were to look at the number of hashtags for dream job versus good enough job, it's probably astronomically different. But there's so much of us tied to this idea of if I just get my dream job, then I'll check all the boxes and I'll move forward, and not enough wrestling with, well, what is that dream job now? And is that going to be the dream job in the future?
Totally. Yeah, I really believe in sort of the seasonality of work. And maybe, in your 20s, that was your time when you were in a season where you wanted to travel around the world and be a facilitator and lead these coaching programs. And maybe in your 40s, it's a different expectation for what your job allows you to do. But I think a better frame, as opposed to a dream job, is trying to find jobs where you are intrinsically motivated to do them. I talked to so many people for the book who worked their way up to the top of some corporate ladder only to find out that they were winning at a game that they didn't actually enjoy playing. They were just chasing, the next promotion or the next raise or something that looked really good on their resume without consulting what actually mattered to them. And there's this great book by Daniel Pink called Drive, where he really unpacks the science of intrinsic motivation. And he says it really boils down to three distinct categories. The first is mastery. So are you growing in the ways that you want to be growing? Are you developing the skills that you want to be developing? The second is purpose. Are you connected to the outcome and the results of the work that you're doing, the impact that you're having in the world? And the third is autonomy. Do you feel like you have enough control to feel like you are in the driver's seat of your own life, to fulfill your own version of what freedom means to you? And I think those sort of what the journalist David Brooks calls eulogy virtues, the things that might not show up on your resume, but are part of your spirit, part of your soul, are much more important things to pursue than just the things that look shiny to the outside. And so that's what I would say in terms of what is worth pursuing. It's not just the shiniest accolades that can lead to a life where you spend your whole life chasing carrots without actually feeling full. But finding that intrinsic motivation and then also having a good sense of why you work, what are you working for, is a great way to think about how your job can support your life as opposed to the other way around.
I know for a lot of our clients who tend to be workaholics, it's also hard for them to find a sense of self and identity outside of work. So when you've been steeped in this culture of perform, 80-hour weeks, do everything that work demands, they often come to us because they don't have a social life, or at least as much of one of those as they'd like, or they don't have their partner because they haven't really spent much time cultivating any identity outside of work. So for those listeners, this idea of a good enough job and having an identity outside of work, I know is almost like a record screech. What can they do to start to think about and develop that sense of identity outside of work if they've fully bought into workaholism and aren't happy there?
There's three things that come to mind for me. The first is carving out space in their days, in their weeks, in their life where work is not an option. That goes back to sort of like the infrastructure point that I was making. If you're always sort of with one eye on work, like a shark sleeping with one eye open, you're never going to be fully present in your life outside of work. The second is, it may sound simple, but if you want to derive meaning from aspects of your life other than work, you have to do things other than work. That means, actually finding meaning, and as opposed to just turning off your brain. No offense to Netflix, but, I converse with a lot of workaholics too. And often they'll say, at the end of the workday, all I can muster doing is, turning on the game or turning on Netflix and turning off my brain. But you have to find actual things to do, activities to reinforce those other identities you hope to cultivate. And the third is I'd encourage them to find communities that couldn't care less about what they do for work. So for example, I love to play pickup basketball. And one of the benefits of like my weekly basketball game is they don't care how many books I've sold that week or how many words I've written. They care that I show up on time, that I'm a good teammate, and that I box out when I rebound. It's a different expectation, a different value system of what matters. I think work provides one container with one set of metrics that matter. Maybe it's, your salary or how many sales you've made that quarter. But I think it's really important that we find other containers to reinforce that we are more than just workers in our life. And I think once those workaholics or often really, type A driven people are able to find communities that aren't just validating them for their professional accomplishments, it becomes a reinforcing cycle where actually it's really refreshing not to always have to be the boss or not to always have to be on or to feel like you get to show up in a way that's different from showing up as, a C-suite executive.
I know for a lot of our clients, we talk about small talk and how to break through and not have boring small talk, but they often don't recognize that even when they're trying to find those communities, they're using what do you do for work as their opening line to start the small talk and framing all of the conversation around work because, well, it's a meritocracy. It's easy to compare resume and certifications and accomplishments in your work life. So that allows them in their type A competitive side to lean in. But if you say, hey, let's shift the conversation to what do you like to do? Well, I don't want to ask that of others because I don't know what I want to do outside of work or what I like to do outside of work. So it's funny how they play it safe by talking about work, and then they struggle to find those communities outside of work because they go to the pickup basketball game and they're just asking you about work, which does lead you get invited to watch the NBA playoffs.
Yeah. It's like a chicken and an egg problem, right? People are working all the time, so they're not sure who they are outside of work, and they're not sure who they are outside of work, and so they work all the time. I was reading this really interesting study recently about new fathers and how some of the most workaholic tendencies are found right after people have a kid. Because when you have a kid, you can contribute a certain amount of input into your child's development, but you don't always get that output back. There isn't always this direct relationship between the energy that you're putting in and the sort of up and to the right growth that you might see as like a Wall Street trader, for example. And so these men are throwing themselves into work in order to be able to feel validation and feel fulfilled. I think especially in the US, like if you look at the data in the 1970s, the average American and the average German worked about the exact same number of hours each year. And now the average American works about 30% more than the average German. And, this is like ahistorical, right? Typically, the richer a person or the richer a country get, the less they work, because frankly, they can afford to work less. But in the United States, some of the greatest increases in work time are coming from the highest earners. So the very people that can afford to work less are working more than ever. And I think it's just a testament to the point that you were just making, is that a lot of these workaholics don't have other sources of meaning in their life other than work. And so they're spending all of their time at the office, even if they don't necessarily have to be doing so.
And of course, everything rolls downhill. So if your managers and your team leaders are working all the time, it's if you're serious about your career, that's of course what you think you're supposed to do.
Totally. Yeah, I'm inspired by some leaders that have taken an alternative approach. I've seen some companies that, for example, have a mandatory minimum vacation requirement, or some companies that have, just cultural norms around communication where after 6 p.m., like you're not allowed to send an email or a Slack message. Everything has to wait till the morning. Or, I talked to Jason Fried from Hay and Basecamp, and he was saying that in the early days, instead of like offering meals at the office, they would help subsidize like CSA boxes so their family could like eat healthy food at home. And I think, one thing that you see of these cultures that really value people's lives outside of the office is it breeds goodwill. It breeds loyalty, it breeds retention, it breeds employees who are actually, excited to show up for work because they realize that their employers understand that they're more than just, an enterprise sales executive or what have you. And I think it's actually ultimately good for the bottom line of a business if they're able to take a long view and say, no, we don't want to be burning out our employees. We want to be able to create cultures that support them to be able to do their best work. And then at the end of the day, to go home and do the things that they love outside of work as well.
Yeah, it reminds me of a moment during the pandemic. My wife's company was trying to team build virtually, and they sent out this craft cocktail mixing kit. And then they forced the entire team to sit on a virtual call with the bartender and learn how to mix cocktails. And we were trying to prepare for our wedding, and we weren't drinking, taking a long break from drinking. And I just remember we're in a room sitting next to her. She's staring at all of her team members on Zoom. No one wants to be there. This craft cocktail person who's doing the Zoom is mixing all these crazy drinks. And of course, it's under the guise of team building. Everyone wants to have a strong team. But when we force our team members to do these activities outside of work in the hopes of creating a great team, it actually burns people out even more. So the idea of creating some guardrails around, hey, like no communication after 6. And it's okay if you go on a long walk after lunch, as long as the things on the to-do list and the big goals for the team are being accomplished. That's what matters more than forcing us into these interactions with our team members under the guise of building a strong culture.
You cannot force that team building. You have to allow that to happen organically. The more pressure you put to make that happen, the opposite effect will happen. And there will be some unity, but that unity will be in condemning the person that is setting up these forced networking and team building exercises.
I was really struck by your research for the book, and I'm really curious, interviewing hundreds of people from all these diverse backgrounds around their work. Like, what was the most surprising insight from those conversations for you, or unexpected that you weren't thinking you'd hear?
There's this one conversation I had with this Wall Street banker, and his name is Kay He, and he's sort of the paradigm of someone who is just like a striver and a hustler. Like he is the first generation Cambodian American, and in high school he set his sights on being the best student so he could get into the best college. And then he went to college and he said, okay, I want to make the most money possible. I could be a lawyer, I could be a banker, I could be an engineer, or I could be a doctor. And he chose banking. And he went to Wall Street and he went to work for BlackRock. And he became the youngest ever managing director in BlackRock's history. And he, by the time he was 30, he had bought an apartment in New York City. He was making 7-figure salary. And he had this like realization moment where he was, preparing to go to a wedding of a friend of his, and his hair fell out. Like the big chunk of his hair fell out from the side of his head. And it was related to stress-related alopecia. And so here's someone who has like all of the trappings of success. It's like graduated from a top college, works at a prestigious company, has a nice title, has all of like the things that you would want from a successful career. And yet he was so stressed that his hair was literally falling out. He didn't have the time in his weeks to spend all of the money that he was making. And I think he represents one end of the spectrum, which is, just valuing what the world values without really considering what you yourself value. But I think I talked to people on the other end of the spectrum where, for example, they took on a massive amount of debt to pursue a graduate degree for a field of study that didn't actually lead to stable job prospects on the other side. Or someone who, left their job to go all in to pursue their art, but now are so stressed about what they're going to do to make rent that they can't actually focus on the art that they hope to be creating. It's like, I think what was most surprising for me is I came in with maybe a little bit more of a hot take and said, our work-centric society is a problem. It's, people are literally dying from overwork. What are we going to do about this? And I left from all the reporting with a more of a lukewarm take, which is to say that, what we do for work matters, and we are all more than what we do for work. And so we have to reconcile these two. We have to hold what the world values in one hand, what we value in the other hand, and try and pursue work that sits at their intersection. And I think it was surprising because we live in an age of hot takes where people either want to lionize work and say, you have to do what you love, and if you don't do what you love, you'll never be happy. Or people that villainize work and, are on the Reddit anti-work thread and saying, work is a necessary evil, universal basic income. We should all just, be able to have full freedom all day. And I think, the actual path to happiness or contentment lives somewhere in the middle. It's not on either extreme.
Well, a lot of that has to do, and we've talked about this. I mean, the work that you're doing, if it's, 100 years ago, people directly saw that what they put into their work affecting their communities, affecting their families, and affecting their society. And now that's hard to see. In fact, for AJ and I could tell you right now that it's hard for us to understand and how people engage with this podcast. We get download numbers. Mm-hmm. And then from that, we have people inquiring about our programs and coming out for training. And those training sessions are incredibly important and fun for AJ and I because we're actually getting to hang out and chat and understand how our content has helped those folks, which makes that's the only thing that makes it all worth it. And because we get a direct response, the feedback loop is there. For many people, a majority of workers now, there is no feedback loop. It's just information going into the atmosphere. And you hope that people are enjoying your work and things like that. It's, again, having an idea what the world values, but also being able to create on your own time and produce for yourself, for your own value and for the value of those around you. That would offset some of that black box that we're dealing with of missing out on meaning and purpose that we do for work, for the world's value rather than our own.
I think that goes right back to what you were talking about in terms of pandemic hobbies. I think one of the reasons why it was so fulfilling for some of these knowledge workers to say, bake sourdough bread is it was an example of an actual physical output that they were able to produce with their two hands, as opposed to this abstraction of what so many of us do in a knowledge economy that isn't actually connected to anything that is physical or anything that is connected to a feedback loop where you see yourself improving other people's lives.
For a lot of us, we're just looking for things to measure. And the easiest thing to measure is the New York apartment and the salary and the bonus and all the accoutrements that come with that versus, the value and meaning that we're deriving internally that brings us joy or makes us happy in the moment. That is a lot harder for us to quantify and then even harder for us to compare to others. So there's always this grass is always greener where the banker would love to be the artist and the starving artist would love to not be so starving and would actually like to have the bank account of the banker. And we're always faced with this duality as we're making our way through this journey. I'd love, for our audience to take away one key for them who've just really dedicated all of their life to this job and impressing others, which we find time and time again in our clients, and then are kind of at that crossroads of, they're making enough money now where their needs are met and like the difference in happiness is pretty nominal. But then internally, they're still feeling that struggle of like, isn't there more to what I'm doing here? Isn't there more to life than this identity that I've created for myself around work?
That's where the title of the book comes in. The reason why I like the term good enough is that if you don't have a definition of what good enough means to you, the default is just more. And, that's part of the sort of DNA of our country. There's sort of Protestant work ethic and capitalism that have entwined to bring us to this point. But my advice for those people is to define what good enough means to them, to really have a keen sense of what is it that they're working for? What about their work is bringing them fulfillment or meaning? Is it the people? Is it the output of what they're doing? Is it their ability to support their loved ones or to put, proverbial bread on the table? And I think once people have actually taken some space and time to consider what it is that they care for, about what it is that they're working for, it relieves some of that pressure that is put on all of us to think that you need to have all of your identity and your meaning come from the work basket, and frees up time to be able to invest in some of those other things that might bring them meaning outside of work as well. The origin of the term comes from this British pediatrician. His name was Donald Winnicott. And in the mid-20th century, he was observing how there's this growing idolization of parenting, where these parents wanted to be the perfect parents. They wanted to shield their kid from experiencing any sort of negative emotion or harm. And then when their kids inevitably started crying or frustrated or angry, the parents took it extremely personally. And so Winnicott proposed this alternative, and as opposed to being sort of the perfect parent, what if you strive to be the good enough parent? And he thought that framework would benefit both the child and the parent. The kid would learn how to self-soothe, how to take care of some of their own issues, and the parents wouldn't lose themselves in their children's emotions. Obviously, I'm making a direct parallel to the working world. Like a crying toddler, our jobs are not something that we can always control. But I think actually a healthy level of detachment from the work that you're doing produces better work as well. We all know people that are sort of rising and falling based on their, say, Instagram follower count or their monthly sales quota. And it's actually by having a little bit of distance from those vanity metrics that allows you to be able to put your work in perspective. And that's, what I'm trying to do with the book, what I hope people take away. It's not the idea that, they have to hate their job or, there's no meaning or purpose or community to be found at work. I've certainly made some of my best friends from work. I've had an immense sense of purpose from being a writer and being able to find a craft and a vocation that I care about. I just hope it's not the only one. And that's the thing that I hope people take away, is that just finding those little pockets to invest in other parts of themselves will benefit them as well-rounded people, and it will benefit their work life too.
I'd love if you'd be willing to get a bit more vulnerable and share what your personal definition of good enough is, having wrestled with this idea and wrote a book about it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the old cliche among authors is that, you write the book that you need to read. And that was definitely the case for me. Like, as I mentioned, I spent my 20s and early 30s sort of swerving between these different industries, trying to find that perfect job. And then, right before this book came out, I was lucky enough to be able to, leave working for corporate overlord and start working for myself. And I thought that everything would be fixed. I'd never have to attend a meeting that should have been an email ever again. And, I started working for myself, and I found that I was actually the worst boss that I'd ever had. It wasn't some culture of a company or manager that was like pushing me to work all the time, or to open my laptop on the weekends, or to feel like shit when I didn't meet my internally imposed goals. It was just my own sort of nature of my self-worth being tethered to my productivity. And it took, going through this research process of talking to all of these people, of looking at all of the latest academic studies about what actually leads to fulfillment at work, that I was able to take a step back and be able to erect some of those boundaries myself. And so some of the things that I do now that I didn't do before, I love having sort of a clear start and stop of the workday. like a little ritual of, this is when I'm going to sign in and this is when I'm going to sign out. And this isn't necessarily one size fits all advice. In the book, I talk about the difference between what I call integrators and segmenters. Integrators are the people that don't mind sort of integrating work in their life and, going to the grocery store at 2 p.m. and then signing back online after their kids go to sleep. Whereas segmenters want more of like, this is the chunk that I'm working. I'm online when I'm online. I'm offline when I'm offline. I found that I'm a segmenter. I like having like a distinct work day and being off when I'm off. I have tried to like be a beginner in things. I think one of the best antidotes to overwork is play, something that is not sort of future oriented, but actually like focused on the present moment. And I'm finding that with, my young son, my wife and I are also taking salsa dancing classes. It's like something that's not for any sort of means to another end, but just for the joy of learning and being a beginner once again. And I've done my own sort of back of the napkin math about like the financials of what do I need to support the life that I want to live, as opposed to just thinking like the closer I am to a billionaire, the more happy I am. Actually understanding, like this is a number that makes sense to support what I want from my goals and our family's goals moving forward. And actually, I don't need to always strive for more and more and more. I can strive to sort of find my definition of good enough, and then feel the benefit of being able to rest.
Yeah. Could you unpack the financial component? We've talked so much about the values and obviously the things that go outside of financial, but I know for many of our audience members, like financial is the most pressing. And getting to that number, I think a lot of people have a overestimate of how much they truly need. So what was the math like for you in going through that process and discovering that number for yourself?
It's particularly pertinent right now. We were talking before we started recording. I have a 6-week-old at home, so I have a new baby. And especially right before we had the kid, I was like so worried about like the finance of raising a kid. And I live in San Francisco. It's an expensive city. I was like, the cost of college is skyrocketing. And like, what am I going to do? Do I have to like sell out and go work a PR job for like a bank in order to like live the life that I want to live? And so I actually sat down and said, okay, like how much money do I want to save? What is like my burn rate on a monthly basis? How much are my sort of fixed costs and how much do I want as a cushion on top of that? And I grossly overestimated sort of the amount of money that I thought I needed to make. And once I actually did the numbers, I had this like real peace of mind of understanding, I'm actually, on track. And I think it's like the wisdom of budgeting. Sometimes you think about budgeting as something that is about pinching pennies, but no, the actual benefit of budgeting is to be able to spend freely, to know that, I do have $1,000 set aside for dinners out this month. And so I don't want to have to think twice about ordering an appetizer or what have you. Just last week I was guest lecturing at Haas, the business school at UC Berkeley. And I had a lot of questions about this, about, how expensive the world is and, and there's no beating around the bush, like the costs of living are increasing. But I was trying to encourage the students to think holistically about their lives. Like if you want to live in a city like Los Angeles or New York or Chicago or San Francisco, what have you, you're going to have to earn a certain level of income. Like the most important thing that jobs provide is an economic contract. It's an exchange of your time and your effort for money. And I think the more clear-eyed we are about that, the better. But you can also make lifestyle choices that decrease that pressure a little bit. If you want to move to a place with a lower cost of living, you don't necessarily have to have that same pressure to make 6 figures coming out of college or to work a job that you hate just because it gives you a good salary. And so I encourage people to start with their vision of a life well lived. What do they want? Do they want to live in a certain place? Do they want to have kids? How many vacations do you want to take a year? What sort of lifestyle do you want to live? And then think about what job or career might support that lifestyle as opposed to the other way around. I don't fault anyone who wants to work in a big consulting job or work for a big bank because it allows them to pay for the life that they want to leave, just as much as I don't fault the barista who, works at a coffee shop so that they have enough time to rehearse with their band and find meaning of their life outside of work. Neither path is more noble, as my mentor would have said. But I think the encouragement is to think holistically about the equation as opposed to just thinking about the job in isolation.
Yeah, and I found the more time that my wife and I have spent wrestling with that, the easier it's been to get off the hedonic treadmill of what everyone else is doing. Like the more clarity you actually have on what it is that you really want and what you and your partner really want on your relationship or as a family, the easier it is to stop worrying so much about the new car your neighbor got or the second house your friend is buying and more focus on, okay, we know exactly what we want this year to look like. We know how many vacations we want to go on. We know where we want to spend our time. We know the things that are important to us. And wrestling with those questions, it feels really hard and challenging in the beginning, but it actually opens up so much more freedom of all the external pressures and noise that I think lead us to making those wrong decisions for us, where we're now carrying a massive mortgage on a house that we didn't really need in a neighborhood that we don't care that much about anymore. And we don't have time to go on vacation because we have to keep this job that we really don't like with a boss that we hate. The more you wrestle with these conversations, and even in college, to be talking to college students and business school students about that, the easier it is to make those clear-eyed choices that allow you to have a well-lived life.
Yeah, I'm curious about you guys too, and thinking about growing your business. Obviously, there's the coaching arm, there's the podcasting arm, other services that you provide. I think I see a lot of people get into entrepreneurship to have more time and autonomy, and then basically design themselves into a job where they're working all the time, where they've expanded beyond their breaches. How have you guys thought about, sustainability with the art of charm and making sure that you're not scaling faster than you actually want to be scaling just for the sake of going up and to the right?
Yeah, I think we're fortunate in our partnership around having check-ins with each other. For a lot of my friends who are entrepreneurs who maybe don't have a business partner or have more control of the business, they're saying yes to everything. And we definitely fell into that trap very early on of like, everything sounds exciting and everything sounds valuable and everything is an opportunity. Now being in business almost 18 years, you start to see, well, yeah, there's downsides to all those opportunities that you chase. There's time away from your family. There's time spinning your wheels. There's learning things that you don't necessarily want to learn or care about. So a lot of the back and forth between the two of us is like, is this really what we want to be doing a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now? Is this really that important? Or is it, what the customers are demanding, but maybe not what we want to be doing with our time? And I think that's what we've been fortunate in building a business that has allowed us that check-in. I know there are a lot of other friends of mine that are entrepreneurs that don't even have that ability in terms of they're locked into the services they provide, and it's pretty rigid in the line of work that they went into or the industry that they chose to what they have to do to meet the bottom line. So that for me has been a big part of it. And then getting married and starting a family, it's like, okay, well, how do I want to orient work in my life? Whereas before that, entrepreneurship was my life. It was the only thing that really mattered, and chasing all those things mattered a lot more. That's been the new way of thinking for me over the last 5-7 years.
For me, like I've learned that for my own sort of value system, time autonomy is like my red Corvette. Like certain people work so that they can buy that McMansion or buy that really expensive car. Like what I am optimizing for in my own career is having as much control over my calendar as possible. And it's different from how I thought about my own career 5 years ago. I used to think that I wanted to be, at the table. I wanted to be in the C-suite. I wanted to be managing a huge team. And that's not what I want anymore. What I want is to be able to have control over my time and be able to have my calendar reflect my values. And so that means I've designed my sort of business of one to be a little bit different from how you might define success if you were just looking at numbers or just looking at external metrics.
I have a lot of conversations with my wife around the consequences of those choices. And are you happy with the consequences that choice will bring? For us, living in a slightly smaller space allows us more time and money for vacation and spending time outside of that space. I know for some of my friends, they want a bigger space with, the man cave and all the extra rooms. So they moved to the suburbs and got a bigger house. So, but all of those choices we make, thankfully, in a position of, the economic freedom to do so, they have consequences. Are you willing to make the choices for those consequences? And do you want to make the car payment? Do you want to have to work overtime to pay for the lake house? Or do you want to spend more time with your family? And do you want to spend more time learning Duolingo instead of trying to have to work the extra hours to pay down the car? Well, I love this conversation, and I know we could go on for hours around the good enough job. I'd love, in wrapping, what's the one single thing that you took in all of the work that you did in putting this book together that's changed your perspective moving forward?
It comes back to something I said earlier, which is at the end of the day, a job is a transaction. It's an exchange of your time and your effort for a paycheck. And certainly it can be a lot more than that. It can be a source of purpose. It can be a source of community. It can be a source of identity. But being clear-eyed about that economic contract that you're signing, whether you are a podcaster and you work for yourself or you work for a large company, is really freeing. It allows you to understand that your job is part of, but not the entirety of who you are. And I'll just echo what I started with, which is that, some people do what they love, others do what they have to so they can do what they love when they're not working. And neither is more noble.
Thank you so much for joining us. Where can our audience find out more about the book and your writing?
You can go to thegoodenoughjob.com. That has all my socials. I run a book club of articles called the Article Book Club. That has a few thousand members if you care about long-form journalism. And my second book's about to come out too, which is about uncertainty and how to get better at dealing with what we don't know. So maybe I'll come back in a year and we can talk about that.
Would love to. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for being here.
Cheers.